Folly is a fascinating word. It comes from the French word for madness.
Folie.
We don't really use it much anymore, but it used to refer to a perfectly commonplace part of everyday life. In Europe, during the Renaissance, people considered mad were not considered ill. They were generally free to roam, to create, and to be themselves. Some writers even praised folly as a valuable and necessary source of insight and force for change. This mentality would abruptly come to an end when madness was medicalized in the mid-17th century, and our ideas about folly and madness would take on a decidedly negative quality, which continues to the present day. When I think of the word folly, nerd that I am, I think of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the groundbreaking 1937 film. While not truly the first feature-length animated movie, it was certainly the first movie of its kind, marketed as a cartoon feature. During production, famously, the press talked about it as Disney's folly, because it sounded like Walt Disney had lost touch with reality. At the time, audiences were only used to seeing animation in shorts that were over in less than 10 minutes. Who would sit through a cartoon that went on for over an hour? It was an endeavor that, understandably, some thought was sure to fail. Within the Disney studio, however, it seemed everyone believed in the project. The studio expanded its staff and provided training sessions so the artists would be prepared to bring a new level of realism to their work. Walt gave more and more of his attention, and his staff's, to the feature, at the expense of the shorts. The short subject was just a filler in any program, Walt later told journalist Pete Martin, and so I just felt I had to diversify my business and get into these other things, and it would give me a better chance. In September of 1937, 2 months before the film's release, Walt held a private screening of the color rushes of Snow White for his staff and distributed a questionnaire to get feedback, as was standard practice at the studio. Unsurprisingly, the film was adored almost unanimously. Of 359 responses, 358 were positive. Walt, however, would remember the negative one. This anonymous response card said 3 words that the studio wouldn't hear the end of for 3 decades. Stick to shorts! There are a few different accounts of who might have written Stick to Shorts, but we don't know. And this anonymity meant anybody could be accused of being the mysterious detractor. And anybody was. Through the years, the term Stick to Shorts became synonymous with poor judgment, wrote animators Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston in their book Disney Animation, The Illusion of Life. If you were trying to sell an idea that did not gel or go over in a meeting, suddenly there would be this loud, "Aha!" and Walt's finger would come shooting out toward you. In a triumphant voice, he would explain, "You must be the guy who said stick to shorts." And for that day, you were the guy, and everyone else would keep looking at you and wondering. The best thing you could do was to become as inconspicuous as possible. Some of the men insisted they knew who the real culprit was and thought that Walt knew, too. But if he did, he was too smart to let on, and he never relented in his continuing search. When I was looking up that quote in the book so I could include it here, I initially checked the index for pages on the production of Snow White, but I noticed that there was a separate listing in the index for what I was after. Stick to Shorts episode at Walt Disney Productions. It's its own part of Disney lore now that fans like to reference. So I ask you, what's that story about? For the Disney staff, I think it was a story about what it was like working for someone with the temperament, intensity, and seemingly selective memory of Walt Disney. For the Disney fans, it's another story about how Walt was always right and the naysayers were always wrong. He was a visionary whose dreams were too big to be contained by the restrictions of cartoon shorts. And so he freed himself from them, and it's a dream come true for you and me. But as we tell this story, we can forget that the anonymous respondent kind of had a point. I mean, I love many of the Disney animated features and other animated movies that followed in their tradition. I'm certainly not saying Walt should have stuck to shorts. But the shorts sure were successful. Walt won a lot of shiny trophies for short subjects. More importantly, their place in media history is, I think, hugely significant. To a large degree, the shorts were where the art of animation as we know it today was developed. They continued to drive the evolution of the medium well after Disney started releasing feature films. They were a space for experimentation, innovation, and play. So let's be sure to never lose sight of one thing. It was all started by the shorts. And you know what else? The shorts were pretty good. Hello, all you happy people. Welcome to the first episode of Stick to Shorts. My name is JD Hansel, and this is a podcast about classic cartoons. This introductory episode is mostly going to lay out some of the major ideas and useful information that I'd like you to keep in mind in future episodes. Sort of like the first day of a new semester in college when everyone's just going over the syllabus. That's because classic cartoons are kind of a complicated topic in some ways. It's a subject that hasn't gotten the attention it deserves in the podcast medium, at least not the cartoons I want to talk about. I have nothing against cartoons made for TV, but I'm not talking about those here. The subject of this podcast is cartoons that ran in movie theaters in Hollywood's golden age. Here's some historical context for listeners who are younger than me. Well, for listeners who are my age or for listeners who are twice my age or younger, movie theaters used to work really differently. If you went to the movies in, say, the 1940s, your ticket wouldn't just be for one movie after some trailers. They'd also show you a newsreel, a second full movie, possibly some other short subject, and a cartoon. That was a must. The people expected a cartoon, regardless of the type of movie they were going to see. These animated short films were generally made for and enjoyed by adult audiences. They had their own category in the Academy Awards. They often were marketed with movie posters and press books like any other films. They were often reviewed in newspapers like any other films. This is all to say, trite as it may be, animation is cinema, or television, or web videos, or video games. Animation is a lot of things, but for the first half of the medium's history, most of it was cartoon shorts. The people who made these cartoons figured out all the basic principles and techniques that are used to make animated films today, and today's great animators have all studied them. Acclaimed directors, ranging from Steven Spielberg to Wes Anderson, have taken inspiration from some of these shorts. So if you want to better understand and appreciate film in general, it's not a bad idea to spend some time with this influential genre. The legacy of these films reaches beyond their place in film history, as many of their characters have become part of wider pop culture. They gave us cartoon stars like Daffy Duck, Donald Duck, and Porky Pig, icons like Mickey Mouse, Woody Woodpecker, and Betty Boop, and celebrated comedy duos like Tom and Jerry, Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote, and Sylvester and Tweety. They featured some of our greatest comic heroes from Bugs Bunny to Mighty Mouse to Popeye the Sailor, as they found every creative way to fight their antagonists, whether they were silly villains like Marvin the Martian, or real-world villains like Adolf Hitler. 40s cartoons are wild, folks. This podcast will focus on cartoon shorts up to about roughly the mid to late 1960s. Maybe a few later ones will get snuck in eventually for context. It's a very Hollywood-heavy show, and rightly or wrongly, probably won't spend all that much time in the silent era. It's going to predominantly feature the best-remembered cartoons from major studios like Disney, Warner Brothers, Fleischer, MGM, eventually some Walter Lantz. It's kind of a greatest hits show, to a point, which is not as fun for longtime cartoon fans who would rather listen to somebody talk about forgotten Van Buren cartoons or whatever. I hear you, I respect you, and I'm very sorry. But for the time being, I'm interested in films that are part of something that's definitely lasted, something that still has a presence. The Looney Tunes, for example, still have a presence. They've got a feature film on the big screen right now starring Daffy Duck, Porky Pig, and Petunia Pig. What a time.
What? Here's the script. Catch up on your own time. We have to act fast, and there's only one person that can do the job. Daffy Duck. Daffy?
Oh, no, not the duck.
Man.
The duck?
That's right. The duck.
But this new movie, The Day the Earth Blew Up, was not distributed by Warner Brothers. They sold the distribution rights to a smaller distributor, Ketchup Entertainment. Coyote vs. Acme may receive the same treatment, which I guess would be an incredible accomplishment for the film that we were told was not allowed to exist. Warner Brothers doesn't seem to have a lot of trust in this brand when they can't pair it with other brands and surround its characters with other IP. Given all the buzz around Coyote vs. Acme, this is all very strange to me. The public sure seems to want these characters. It's the studio's imaginary public that doesn't give a darn. That leaves the classic cartoon stars in a paradoxical place. It's clear that they have staying power, but with how little their company values them, it's not clear how long they'll stay. Remarkably, if the cartoon icons are undervalued, the short films that made them iconic are somehow, at least in some ways, even less respected and given less attention. I think one of the reasons for the underappreciation of the shorts is that it's kind of hard to know how to approach them. For one thing, there are just a lot of these, like thousands upon thousands of classic cartoon shorts, with Warner Brothers alone producing about 1,000. For another, much of the educational material you'll find on classic cartoons is fairly studio-specific. That's not bad, but I do think that can make the big picture a little harder to track, at least if you haven't taken an animation history course. You'll get parts of the story from watching the Academy Award winners or going through the 50 Greatest Cartoons book, but I feel like some other pathways ought to be available to bring more of the pieces together in an approachable way. That's what I'll try my best to do here. Now, you may ask, as well you should, who the heck are you to be hosting a podcast about this? The truth is, I'm not the best person to do it. I'm certainly not the most knowledgeable person on the subject. I have taken an animation history course, and I think it was a pretty darn good one, but I have to acknowledge that, compared to the experts, I only have bits and pieces of information, and most of it is likely only at the surface level. For better or worse, producing this podcast is going to be my education in the subject. I'm looking forward to discovering more of the history that made the medium of animation what it is, and I hope you get something of value out of joining me on this journey, and can forgive a few slip-ups along the way. With that said, I do have some experience that's relevant to the task at hand, or at least adjacent to it, if only from my many years of making very nerdy media for fans of very silly things. You see, I'm one of the staff writers for ToughPigs.com, the premier Muppet fan site. ToughPigs is the home of thousands of articles by a terrific team of writers, along with a wide array of podcasts and other media celebrating the legacy of Jim Henson. ToughPigs has become a brand that the makers of Muppet Media trust, enabling us to frequently interview and collaborate with the people who perform Muppets, the people who write for Muppets, and sometimes Muppet characters themselves.
Tough pigs, huh? Tough pigs? I'll show you a tough pig! Oh, yeah! Miss Piggy!
If you're familiar with the site, you might know me from some of the articles I've written, like Who Was Jim Henson? I host a podcast called The Great Muppet Fandom Panel, which you'll find on the feed Muppet Fan Podcasts with ToughPigs.com. If you know ToughPigs' flagship podcast, Moving Right Along, there's an episode from last year's season on Muppet Treasure Island called The Mary Poppins Carpet Bag Gag, for which I was the guest, and it's one of the most fun conversations I've ever had. I encourage all Muppet fans who know that movie, love it or hate it, to go seek out that episode. This podcast, of course, is not a ToughPigs project, even though most of the guests will probably be my Muppet fan friends, since that's who I know. For what it's worth, most episodes of this show will be conversations, not solo pieces like this one. Although you will hear a little bit of my conversation with one of my ToughPigs pals near the end of this episode. You should know about one other thing I'm bringing with me from ToughPigs. I supervise an article series called The ToughPigs Beacon that looks at the Muppets' relationship to neurodiversity. As an ADHDer, I'm always interested in looking at media through the lens of the neurodiversity paradigm, and with a focus on how a given text thinks about disability and thinks about thinking. That's all relevant when looking at classic cartoons. My take is that many of these classic cartoon stars are examples of neurodivergent heroes, a valorization of thinking in ways that don't conform to social norms. I'll refine that thesis a bit more over the course of the show. The point of all this is to say that I'm used to making podcasts about, and giving serious thought to, media that is kinda next door to classic cartoons. Because of that experience, I already have things in common with people who've been active in the cartoon fan space. I'm used to seeing works I care about pulled from streaming services. I'm very familiar with the experience of seeing the works of media I value greatly dismissed as kid stuff, even though I know darn well that they've always been loved by adults. Of course, everybody says they love them, but few people bother to learn more about them. And that's a shame. The best thing to do about that, we found, is to get together with friends and talk about how we feel about this stuff. That's what this podcast is for. Until recently, I was one of the people who didn't bother to learn that much about cartoons, despite my love for them. The Muppets received nearly all of my fandom attention, while my interest in classic cartoons was usually much more casual. Sometimes I was really into them for a month here or there, adding more titles to my DVD and Blu-ray collection, but I would eventually lose interest. It was only very recently, in the summer of 2024, when something changed for me that, so far, hasn't changed back, even when I've kind of wanted it to. It's hard to say what exactly happened. I was feeling really down about the current state of the world, and for a moment these cartoons offered me a pleasant distraction. But it quickly became much more than escapism. It fit into a larger change in perspective and focus for me. You see, as I've been trying to figure out what can be done about today's real-world problems, I keep finding myself unsure of what to do next because I'm unsure of what happened to get us here. So I recently started taking history classes, and I've found I have a passion for this I didn't really know about. I found that watching these cartoons that are products of, and reflections of, the Great Depression era, World War II, and the post-war period, has given me a fun way to mentally place myself in these historical moments that made our modern world. Then, I had a seemingly harmless thought. I should be listening to podcasts about classic cartoons, with how many bajillion Disney podcasts there are, along with so many others about voice acting and other aspects of animation. Surely, there must be a ton of classic cartoons podcasts. To my shock, while good work had been done, that was sort of like what I was after, my options were few and far between. All I was looking for was a podcast that devoted a conversation to each of the major works of this genre, like a typical movie podcast, except the movies would be the popular and acclaimed animated shorts. And I found no such podcast. No episode devoted to Toot Whistle Plunk and Boom. No episode devoted to Rudy Toot Toot. That's both of the great toots of American cinema getting overlooked. I mean, they come up in podcasts covering animation more generally, or focusing on the Academy Award nominees, and that's all valuable. But I was in the mood to listen to a show that gives each of the major classic shorts their due, regardless of whether or not the Academy noticed them. I know there's a Looney Tunes podcast, that's not quite all folks, that looks at that whole franchise, past to present, which is a cool approach to Looney Tunes. But my goal with this show is to take just their classic shorts and understand them in the context of their contemporaries. How were the Looney Tunes influenced by the Disney cartoons? How were they influencing the MGM cartoons? What are these studios doing similarly, and why? How are they differentiating themselves? What's interesting about animation from this period is that there's so much movement between studios, sometimes because specific artists moved around, but other times because ideas moved. My goal is to look at the whole industry as one big conversation. I also know that there was a podcast a few years ago called Cartoon Logic that did some highly thoughtful and knowledgeable analyses of a bunch of these cartoons from different studios. It was pretty quick to dive into subjects that are a little off the beaten path, and I appreciate that a lot. I do. But since I'm more of a novice than they are, my podcast will likely stay on main roads for a while. I should say that it's very possible that the podcast I'm wishing existed already did exist a long time ago, and has since disappeared from the internet. I mean, both of the Muppet podcasts that got me into Muppet fandom all those years ago, totally gone. So I can imagine the same may be true of cartoon review podcasts. Nevertheless, as it now stands, the space for a podcast with the premise, what if there was a podcast about cartoon shorts, is weirdly currently available. And the more time I've spent preparing for this show, the more I've understood why that is.
And now, the reasons why nobody should ever make this podcast.
Number 1. Everyone grew up with different cartoons. That means everyone has a different sense of which cartoons are canonical, but more than that, everyone has a different sense of which cartoons are worth talking about at all, whether they're good, bad, or just weird. All the people I've reached out to be guests on the show have had totally different lists of interests, which is convenient for me in most respects. I'm glad that not everyone is requesting What's Opera Doc, but nevertheless, it means that my audience doesn't really share much of a sense of priorities. It kind of can't. So I'm not really sure what the greatest hits of classic cartoons are. It's very hard to tell. I can only think of a small handful of cartoons that most everybody who likes cartoons has seen, but I have a much larger list of cartoons that would be worth covering in the first year of this show. It includes well over 500 shorts, and it's only going to keep growing. I can't do one cartoon an episode, one episode a week, and hit 500 or even 100. That doesn't math. So, this is going to be interesting, gang. I mean, I'm glad that I'll get to introduce casual fans and younger fans to films they've never seen before. That's a lot of the fun of doing a show like this. But that's kind of tricky, given the state of cartoon accessibility. Reason 2. Getting listeners to watch along is a big ask. Let's talk about cartoon availability. Back when I started developing this show in August of 2024, this would not have been nearly as big of a deal. The Boomerang streaming service offered access to a dense library of classic cartoons, some of which have never been released on DVD or Blu-ray, and the subscription cost was low. Then Warner retired that service in September and didn't really have a replacement. Supposedly this was to direct traffic to another streaming service of theirs, Max. But Max only has a tiny fraction of those cartoons, and it's only gotten tinier. What's weird is that fraction includes several Tom and Jerry shorts that they just released on Blu-ray. But you know what's weirder? At the start of the opening weekend of The Day the Earth Blew Up, a Looney Tunes movie, Max had relatively few classic Looney Tunes shorts to begin with, and by the end of that weekend, it had none. They were all taken down. However, I must admit that all in all, these cartoons are more available than ever before. That's thanks to the dedication of collectors, the support of fans, and the advocacy for these shorts from within studios like Warner Brothers. It's just that they're scattered across several DVDs and Blu-rays. I like collecting those, but if you're a casual fan who wants to follow along with this podcast but can't justify spending the money to collect all of the cartoons right now, it's a little inconvenient. Of course, on the internet, these cartoons tend to be around, just not always in an official capacity. So, just to summarize the state of things for classic cartoon fans right now, we just had some of our favorite characters on the big screen. We've got access to hundreds of cartoons in HD on home video, several hundred others fully restored for DVD, thousands of others bouncing around the internet, and always some number of cartoons on streaming services in high definition. There are also cartoons running all day long on the TV station MeTV Toons. It's great. At the same time, Disney is failing to deliver on Blu-ray, Disney Plus is ignoring many of the classic short films that built the company, Boomerang is dead, Max has taken away the Looney Tunes, and Warner Brothers is flicking Looney Tunes projects off its body like they're insects. So how are we supposed to manage this little cartoon book club of a podcast I'm trying to run? Well, here's the plan. If you want to buy a small number of DVDs that include a large percentage of the cartoons we'll be covering, I recommend the Looney Tunes Complete Platinum Collection. It's a DVD-only repackaging of their 3 earlier Looney Tunes Platinum Blu-ray releases. If you can get each of the Blu-rays, that's much better because those have bonus features and look prettier, but that's a lot more money. This collection doesn't have all the Warner cartoons I want to cover, but right now, it's a very inexpensive way to get 150 of the major cartoons from that studio. I also think Volume 1 of the Tex Avery Screwball Classics will come in handy, and will also just provide you with a lot of entertainment and joy and laughter. On my end, I will try to make sure each season of the podcast features a good number of cartoons that are very widely available. Often stuff on official YouTube channels or in the public domain, and often stuff on Disney Plus, since that library, it's been reasonably stable, incomplete as it may be. Now, here's what I think will help you the most. I'm going to be posting short availability guides on social media. They won't be totally comprehensive, but they'll give you at least some idea of where you can find some of these cartoons officially, if you'd like to. So, follow the show at Stick to Shorts on Blue Sky so you can see these, and I might post them on Facebook as well, and these will tell you which cartoons are coming up soon on the podcast, and roughly where you can find them. Reason 3. It's a whole lot of watching evil stuff. It's a feature of this genre that I don't exactly know how to handle for the purposes of this podcast. Part of what attracted me to taking on this project in the first place was the opportunity to investigate American history in the mid-20th century, and any attempt to do that without some interrogation of the way racism and sexism are drivers of so much of American history just doesn't work. It doesn't work. It's not very honest, and I don't know how much you can learn from that. On the other hand, there's definitely an audience for classic cartoons that's always like, give me the bad stuff, give me the bad stuff, I want to see the bad stuff. And I'm not really here for catering to that audience. I'm inclined to push back against the canonization of films that have largely become legendary because of their extravagant show of racism. Like, realistically, how much will it matter if I don't cover the censored 11? I mean, I'm not saying they shouldn't be made available or that they don't matter, just that I don't know that I really need to get into those here. If you don't know what the censored 11 are, in 1968, the television syndication rights to many of the Warner Brothers cartoons that had been produced in, years before belonged to United Artists. That company elected to stop showing 11 of these cartoons on television due to their racial stereotypes, and in the time since, they've never gotten a DVD or Blu-ray release. Warner Brothers screened 8 of the 11 at the first TCM Classic Film Festival in 2010. Film historian Donald Bogle, who has written extensively about cinematic depictions of African Americans, hosted the screening, which sounds like a good way to present them responsibly. I, however, am not Turner Classic Movies. I am but a singular white man. Does the world need me to offer my opinions on these films? Probably not. Do I feel a strong personal need to gab about them? Not beyond what I'm saying about them in this episode. Do I have access to noted film historians who can combine... Should I say historians or historians? Like, I always feel weird about that, because I think the H is not supposed to be there. But I feel like I'm putting on an accent to sound more proper than I really am if I drop the H. Let me know in comments somewhere which pronunciation makes you more angry, and I'll probably ignore you. Where was I in this? Do I have access to noted film historians who can combine a scholarly understanding of the material with their own lived experience as members of the communities being misrepresented? I guess that remains to be seen, right? But I don't know about that. Like, I feel like this podcast would have to become halfway important, maybe even really important, for me to be comfortable reaching up and tugging on the pant legs of the historians to ask them to stoop down to this podcast's level and help talk us through these things. And besides, the neat thing about experts is that they've usually written down their thoughts on the subject of their expertise, so I could always just read them. I could just direct your attention to the work that the experts have already done to grapple with this stuff, and then I save the experts some time. I was going to say I save you some time and me some time. I guess I really just save the experts some time. For the purposes of making this podcast approachable and halfway enjoyable, I'll have content warnings in the show notes that try to give you a sense of what you're getting yourself into. I'll try to include those in the little guides I mentioned before that go on Blue Sky, and maybe Facebook as well. Having said all that, if we want to talk about where these cartoons sit in history, then the question of how their owners and distributors have handled their problematic elements is a big part of that. In fact, it's the subject of the first essay in Kevin S. Sandler's Reading the Rabbit, a 1998 collection of essays by various writers on the Warner Brothers cartoons and their legacy. This book was actually one of the biggest inspirations for the Muppet fan website I write for, the aforementioned ToughPigs.com. ToughPigs started as writer Danny Horn's project to turn the critical eye of post-structuralist literary analysis toward the Muppets. It eventually morphed into a fun comedy blog, and I love it as it is, but I always meant to reconnect it with its roots. Once I started preparing a cartoons podcast, I knew I would need to take a look at this book, and what I found when I cracked open Reading the Rabbit is a glimpse into a moment in the history of cartoons that looks strangely similar to the state they're in now, just in a more 90s way.
Everybody get up, it's time to slam now. We got the real jam going down. Welcome to the Space Jam. Here's your chance, do your dance at the Space Jam. Alright.
When Sandler was writing in the late 90s, he had seen this wave of new scholarship analyzing animation, but most of it was focused on Disney. This in itself may have seemed like a win for animation given its low status in academia. He quotes the editors of the 1995 essay collection From Mouse to Mermaid, saying that Disney was finally done being the ugly stepsister unfit for the glass slipper of high theory, but Warner Brothers, Sandler writes, has yet to find its fairy godmother. There was still a need for somebody to give more serious analytical attention to the Warner cartoons, and the writers of Reading the Rabbit intended to do just that. They were doing it just in time, too, because the Looney Tunes seemed to be in a state of crisis. That might be a surprising assessment of the situation given how present they were in the culture. Space Jam had just been a big hit a few years earlier. Between the new TV series starring Looney Tunes characters, airings of the original cartoons on Nickelodeon and ABC, and the prominence of Michigan J. Frog on the WB, the Looney Tunes stars were very visible on television at the time. Laserdisc and VHS made it easier than ever before to watch many of the classic cartoons at any time. What's the problem? Well, Looney Tunes had come to mean two very different things. Officially, it was a cast of lovable characters who represented Warner Brothers content for the family. Very friendly, very safe. Unofficially, though, the Looney Tunes that people fell in love with as children were not friendly, not safe. Sandler contrasts the way Bugs Bunny was handled in the U.S., appearing on stamps to get kids into stamp collecting, with what was happening to Bugs across the pond. In 1996, The Bad Bugs Bunny Show and its sequel, The Bad Bugs Bunny Show 2, were shown at the Prince Charles Cinema in London. This totally unofficial presentation included cartoons from Warner Brothers, Disney, MGM, and Fleischer, and its selling point was that these cartoons were politically incorrect. Now, here's the thing about that. Please bear with me for just a minute. I would argue, and this is not what Sandler is writing about in his piece, but I would argue that a lot of the grumbling we used to hear about the words politically incorrect has been replaced in recent years by fuming over the four-letter W word. And all of this discourse surrounding these terms has just gone to more and more ruinous places. So far, it hasn't helped us much, gang. And I honestly think that so much of what gets labeled as political correctness is really just about trying to be mindful of how marginalized and oppressed people are affected by the words we use and by how they're portrayed. But the label of political correctness reframes that as censorship. In this framework, someone showing concern is not really being thoughtful and considerate. That doesn't sound like a person, and they couldn't be an actual victim of oppression who's genuinely expressing how they're being hurt and what people can do to repair the harm. I would be able to intuit if that was happening. In truth, when you see the society you live in talking about you in a way that shows it doesn't care about you, that's a scary thing. For most purposes, I would say that framing that fear and that hurt as someone getting offended is a dishonest flip of the power dynamic, pretending that someone's desperate pleas are reprimands and scolding from on high. But here's the rub. We all know that's generally not what's going on with corporate decisions. Disney and Warner Brothers have been trying to cover their butts, and that's all. They're not civil rights organizations, they're capitalist conglomerates. Sandler writes, quote, "When boycott or embarrassment threaten present-day company profit and image, Disney and Time Warner must meticulously manage the dissemination of potentially controversial material to the public. The cultural iconography and ideology associated with their main assets, Mickey Mouse and Bugs Bunny, must be vigilantly controlled. When Donald Duck celebrated his 50th birthday in 1984, the Academy Award-winning Der Führer's Face, 1943, which satirically presents Donald hailing the Third Reich, was omitted from commemorative videotapes. Disney's Song of the South, 1946, has neither been shown in theaters since 1982, nor been released on video in the United States because of racial stereotypes." End quote. Do you see what's happening there? This is not necessarily something that Sandler is doing wrong, but he sees the withholding of racial stereotypes and the withholding of images of Donald Duck in a Nazi uniform as part of an anti-Nazi satire as offenses in the same category. The Bad Bugs Bunny Show, likewise, presents the cartoon Hair Meets Hair, in which Bugs does an impression of Hitler, alongside Bugs in blackface in fresh hair, as though they're comparable. There's a pretty big difference in who is getting spoofed in those cartoons. One cartoon is punching up at a white supremacist empire, and the other is punching down at black people. But they are comparable in how much they go against the brand. They invite you to imagine how upset a modern-day parent, or as it were, a 90s day parent, would be to find that the video they bought for their kid with cute smiling cartoon characters on the cover is showing their kid Nazis. More than that, one imagines corporate executives imagining that modern-day parent, and consequently leaping up from their desks, running around screaming, arms flailing as they pull out their hair and throw each other out of 10-story windows. Therein lies much of the appeal of fighting for the release of cartoons the companies don't want you to see. I mean, come on. Why should Warner Brothers executives get to make the moral judgments anyway? What do they know, right? In fairness, sometimes they'll make decisions based on what communities have said about their products. When the Japanese American Citizens League contested the inclusion of a particularly racist cartoon in the Golden Age of Looney Tunes Laserdisc collection, one complaint was enough for Warner Brothers to pull the collection from store shelves. I think it was later re-released with a different Bugs Bunny cartoon in its place. I don't know that that was necessarily the perfect way to handle that situation, but I don't know, it's fine. On the other hand, when Warner decides not to feature Speedy Gonzales, it's not because they're listening to America's Hispanic community, which, in fact, has a long history of defending Speedy. It's because they want to protect their brand. And the rooms where decisions are made about how to protect the brand have probably not been very diverse rooms, I would wager. So, They've often gone about releasing this material unprepared for how audiences will feel, or uninformed as they overcorrect. I say that's a structural issue, a consequence of capitalism and systemic white supremacy and all that jazz, but most people don't talk about it that way. With that having been said, Sandler is justified in approaching the situation in the 90s realistically. These companies were meticulously controlling their product, hiding away parts of the history that were not part of how they branded themselves, and that they imagined could lead to unfavorable press. Sandler writes, "Rewriting history serves Disney in two ways. First, by policing memory, Disney can construct and control popular memory. Forgetting the past becomes a means of mobilizing its image of childhood innocence. Second, by securing memory, Disney commodifies memory. Cultural consumption of its products marks and legitimizes the virtues of American fun, innocence, and identity." End quote. In that moment, the Looney Tunes characters were getting Disneyfied. They were becoming corporate symbols, and that meant that new media and marketing featuring the characters had to remove their rough edges and make them sweeter, tamer, unobjectionable. To do that, Warner would have to take attention away from a lot of their history. This means the Looney Tunes classic material couldn't necessarily keep the characters alive. It needed to be carefully controlled. But the new material couldn't keep the characters alive either, because it couldn't let them be true to themselves. Sandler concludes, "Let's hope that Warner Brothers Animation does not lead Termite Terrace to the Magic Kingdom, stressing civility over impertinence, pleasantries over hilarity." The lukewarm success and critical failure of Space Jam raise the important question, are the Looney Tunes characters headed in the right direction? Time Warner should take the advice of one of its own, Bugs Bunny. In Invasion of the Bunny Snatchers, Bugs wonders, maybe if I get rid of these robot retreads, the genuine articles would come back. Heed the Lagomorph's wise recommendation. The day may soon come when "that's all, folks" becomes a reality. End quote. Of course, we now know that Looney Tunes has lasted. It's never taken quite the same shape that it had, and, to my liking, has never been quite as lovable as Looney Tunes were. But they stick around, and that's a lesson to keep in mind right now when there's a lot of panicking going on about their future. We also know that only a few years after Sandler was writing, Disney found a way to release a lot of the most unseemly sides of its cartoon history on home video, the Walt Disney Treasures collection. These DVDs were designed to provide a little bit of context for what you were seeing, and with noted film historian Leonard Maltin as their host, you were reminded that you weren't just watching a compilation of cartoons for little kids, you were watching classic films. Warner Brothers, on the other hand, would go much further with its answer to the Walt Disney Treasures, the Looney Tunes Golden Collection. These releases, at least most of them, featured disclaimers, sometimes delivered by Whoopi Goldberg, addressing the racist images you were about to see and saying some version or another of, "These images were wrong then and are wrong now, but to remove them would be the same as claiming they never existed." I don't know that that's necessarily true. I mean, there are certain contexts in which it might be appropriate to show edited and censored versions of the cartoons, especially since those have been part of their history for several decades. Certainly, for the sake of a children's collection, I think it would be acceptable to clean them up. That's not pretending the harmful images never existed so much as it's recognizing that not every context is the right context for the bad stuff. I just don't want to see that get in the way of them releasing the original versions. And here we see the central conflict of classic cartoon distribution. On the one hand, these companies are in the business of making entertainment. On the other hand, these companies are in the business of owning history. When you think about it, the moment that any of their movies leave theaters, those movies become pieces of history. They're from a particular year, from a particular month, from a particular opening weekend. Yet, these must continue to entertain. Entertain is a present tense verb. These companies need history to be actively doing something now. That something is entertaining. If streaming services were presented as something more like museums, archives, or libraries, it would be a different story, I think. There would be no conflict, no obligation to be entertainment. That's not me saying that these cartoons don't entertain people in the present. Of course, I think they're typically still really entertaining. It's just that on an entertainment service, everything included becomes part of how a company is choosing to entertain you now. In a way, it's very much like they're performing it for you now. Being an entertainer and being the owner of pieces of 20th century history and culture sure sound like different jobs to me that probably shouldn't be jammed together. But for these companies, they're inseparable. When you also consider the conflict between the mission to preserve history and the mission to do whatever makes money, and only whatever makes money, it sure sounds like there are much bigger obstacles to the preservation and availability of these cartoons than a few concerned parents. But you know what's wild? If you, for whatever reason, are just itching to see Disney Plus show you something awful that goes totally against their brand, if you want to see Mickey Mouse in blackface, that's on there. The 2022 documentary Mickey, the Story of a Mouse includes clips of that very thing, and it talks about how that's a harmful part of Mickey Mouse's history and Mickey Mouse's legacy that has to be acknowledged. Disney is able to contextualize this stuff appropriately when they want to, and they're willing to do that for the sake of their characters. The cartoon itself that comes from is not on Disney+. They're not willing to do it for the films they come from. Once again, we see this interesting prioritization of the characters over the shorts themselves. They're willing to show you that these cartoons have a history, that they were part of history even when it was bad, but focusing on the original artifacts of history doesn't matter much to these companies. If anything, they might seem almost threatening if they acknowledge that the essential works that define these characters are all historical, and regardless of whether or not they contain anything harmful, they're still historical. That might suggest that these are characters who were great in history, not characters who are great. But you know what? Even if that were true, that wouldn't stop these characters from being really interesting. In fact, I think they're most interesting when approached as expressions of the thoughts and feelings and attitudes and ambitions of people in another time. I think to really understand these characters at all, and to understand the longevity of franchises like the Looney Tunes, you have to look back to the original short films that made them. To fully appreciate the original short films, it helps to know at least a little bit of what was happening around them. So, as we start moving this episode towards its featured cartoon short, I'd like to talk about how the Looney Tunes' signature style of comedy came to be. I guess I should really underline that this is the history as I understand it for right now. I'm trying to avoid making factual errors on this podcast, of course, but if I say something that's not true, you can send corrections to jd@sticktoshorts.com, and I will try to clear things up in future episodes. I'd actually like to start this history lesson/argument with a famous quote that an animation expert would be inclined to contest. Walt Disney's famous line, "It was all started by a mouse." Of course, animation had its accomplishments before Mickey Mouse, the Disney studio started well before Mickey, and Walt had found moderate successes in his career before Mickey. So, depending on how literal you want to be, it was not all started by a mouse. Even the sound cartoon, Mickey's big innovation, had a precedent in the Fleischer Studios' Screen Songs. And yet, that quote really does capture what a big turning point Steamboat Willie was, not just for Walt or his studio, but for the whole animation business. If you'll forgive me for oversimplifying things, once the world heard the mouse's whistle in late 1928, the industry was following Disney's lead, often by creating imitation Mickeys. Mickey was the biggest cartoon star of the early years of the Great Depression, and it only makes sense that he would strike a chord at the time. He was a working-class everyman, but given that he had an Irish name and a personality modeled after Charlie Chaplin's Tramp, he was also something of an outsider. His work typically took the form of a simple narrative that, to my mind, captures the moral and political philosophy that most classic cartoons either expressed or subverted. The meek little guy comes out on top of the big and strong. In Mickey's early cartoons, he brings a sense of play to everything he does, and that play can change the highly elastic and fantastical world around him as he turns animals into musical instruments or farm equipment into an airplane. In that, he embodies an optimistic spirit and brings a sense of reassurance that, with the right attitude, you can make everything okay. "The Disney world is a world out of order. All traditional forms seem not to function," wrote cultural historian Warren Sussman. "And yet the result is not a nightmare world of pity and terror, a tragic world, but a world of fun and fantasy with ultimate wish fulfillment, ultimate reinforcement of traditional ways and traditional values. He also wrote, "No matter how disordered the world appears, Disney and his Mickey Mouse, any of his heroes or heroines, can find their way back to happy achievement by following the announced rules of the game." End quote. Keep that philosophy in mind for a bit, okay? For animation in the 1930s, Disney set the standard. In fact, Walt seemed determined to keep resetting the standard, creating more sophisticated cartoons each year. He was after a kind of realism, so his studio learned how to create more believable physics, more believable backgrounds, and, above all, more believable characters with more personality. This approach was vindicated with the tremendous success of Disney's Three Little Pigs. Chuck Jones, who would later be one of the most celebrated directors of Warner Brothers cartoons, would remember this cartoon as the start of a whole new approach to characters in animation. Quote, "There were three characters who looked alike and acted differently. The way they moved is what made them what they were. Before that, in things like Steamboat Willie, the villain was a big heavy guy and the hero was a little guy. Everybody moved the same. Even in Fleischer's stuff, the basic difference between Popeye and Bluto was the size difference, not the action difference." End quote. Three Little Pigs was one of Disney's Silly Symphonies, a series without a central character that gave the animators freedom to try different things. It initially started as a vehicle for the music of Disney's particularly impressive composer, Carl Stalling. A format that featured music this way would have been especially useful to a studio that owned a large catalog of songs it wanted to advertise to the public, as was the case for Warner Brothers. Soon, several studios were pretty transparently trying to make their products comparable to Disney's Silly Symphonies in both their style and their marketing, right down to the series titles. And I want to underline something about those titles. From what I've seen, they usually took one of two forms. Once the Silly Symphonies went to Technicolor, some studios wanted to emphasize their competitive color spectacles, resulting in titles like Color Rhapsodies, Rainbow Parade, and the remarkably uninspired Color Classics. The most straightforward option was to copy Silly Symphonies more directly with a happy word followed by a musical word. This gave us Merry Melodies, along with Happy Harmonies. Many years later, even after the Silly Symphony series was long retired, Columbia would distribute cartoons called Jolly Frolics, which I think is trying to do the same thing, except it's just the happy word twice. All of those names sure sound nice. Those sound like very nice things. But then, there's the most successful competitor to Silly Symphonies, or at least it's the most recognizable name today, Looney Tunes. And that name's kinda different, isn't it? It doesn't approach silly as a synonym for happy, but as a synonym for foolish. Looney is the only word in any of these titles that has a negative connotation in just about every context. Other cartoon series promise to bring you music and happiness, but Looney Tunes promise to bring you music and threaten to bring you insanity. And yet, it took a while for the series to grow into its name. I won't get into the really early history of the Looney Tunes right now because, well, it's best saved for another time since it's not really the story I'm trying to tell today. Besides, as Leonard Maltin put it, quote, "I don't think there's a lot of progress you can trace from the 1930 Looney Tunes to the 1933 Looney Tunes, let's say." End quote. However, I'll give you this super short version. Once upon a time, there was a Hollywood producer named Leon Schlesinger who had a good relationship with Warner Brothers and wanted to get into producing cartoons. He contracted with a team of former Disney animators, Hugh Harman and Rudolph Ising. These two had their own Mickey Mouse ripoff named Bosco, who became the studio's first star, and they also had the impressive animation of another Disney defector, Friz Freleng. Friz would eventually become a major director at the studio. Harman and Ising got a lot of creative freedom with Schlesinger, who really didn't demand much from the cartoons at all except that they include a chorus of a Warner Brothers song to please the people paying the checks. But Harman and Ising wanted more money. As it happens, due to the effects of the Depression, Warner Brothers had just amended their contract with Schlesinger to reduce how much they paid for the cartoons, bringing the budget for each short to less than half of what Disney's shorts had. Schlesinger couldn't pay Harman and Ising anymore, or the cartoons would cost more than they made. So they split, taking Bosco and their animators with them over to MGM. I'd like to highlight an interesting advertisement that MGM made in 1935 to celebrate the arrival of Harman and Ising. If you happen to have Leonard Maltin's book Of Mice and Magic, you can see it on page 282. There's a cartoon animal handing Harman and Ising a trophy labeled Cartoon Champs, below the bold-faced word, "This year it's harmonizing." In the smaller print below, it says, "There's a new deal in cartoons. It's MGM's Happy Harmonies cartoons in Technicolor." When audiences began to yawn at the same old stuff, along came the youngbloods of the cartoon field. I find this so fascinating since, as I understand it, these two were not game changers. They just played Disney's game relatively well for a rival studio. This was simply a good sales pitch at the time. The mid-30s were the New Deal era, and the people were eager to see anything but the same old stuff. When FDR became president in 1933, his New Deal was a response to the growing demand for radical change in the United States. One White House aide in FDR's administration, I think it was Tugwell, but I haven't found a source to my liking to confirm that, is quoted as saying, "We were confronted with a choice between an orderly revolution or a violent overthrow of the whole capitalist structure." End quote. Roosevelt and his team chose the orderly revolution, creating many public services that are still in place for the next few days maybe. This new active role for the federal government in ensuring the well-being of citizens and protecting the people from the practices of big business was not so much motivated by a particular political ideology of Roosevelt's, he didn't seem to have one, but by a philosophy of bold, persistent experimentation. This was in sharp contrast to the philosophy of the previous president, Herbert Hoover. Hoover's largely hands-off approach to the Depression was particularly in line with the conventional wisdom of the time. The American economy was supposed to snap back into shape on its own, so Hoover seemed to think that there wasn't much to worry about. He was also a proponent of American individualism. All that was needed for Americans to succeed was individual effort with a bit of elbow grease. This combination of optimism and individualism strikes me as very Disney. This is why I'm inclined to think that even though the Disney studio captured the American spirit in the early years of the Depression, and it was very successful through the New Deal era, there was only so much it could capture the spirit of the New Deal era. It's not that Disney wasn't employing bold, persistent experimentation, but he did so in the service of normalizing cartoon fantasy. What I mean by this is two things. First is the goal of achieving the same status and legitimacy of live-action films by making a cartoon feature film. And second is the changes in style and practice that came with that, the move toward realism. I mean, if we think of Walt as someone who made dreams come true, that means bringing fantasy, dreams, into reality, truth. This approach, while immeasurably valuable to the art form, was just begging for someone to rebel against it with a real radical new deal for animated cartoons. Enter Tex Avery.
I found gold! Gold?
As animator Eric Goldberg put it, quote, "Tex Avery is absolutely the author of the Warner style. Before Tex, there just wasn't one." End quote. Tex had moved to Hollywood with the ambition of having a successful comic strip, but when that didn't pan out, he decided to really focus on making the best of his job as an animator. He had some experience as an assistant director at the Walter Lantz studio, and when Leon Schlesinger was desperately seeking a new director for his cartoons after Harmon and Ising left, Tex said he was a director and got the job. In the words of animator John Canemaker, quote, "Whereas Disney wanted to draw you in and make you believe these cartoons were real, Tex Avery didn't care about that. He wanted to go the opposite direction." End quote. Tex focused on wild gags that could only happen in cartoons, taking jokes to the greatest extreme he could get away with to get the biggest laughs. He had kindred spirits at the studio in the very young, very eager animators Chuck Jones and Bob Clampett. Schlesinger set them up in a little frame building on the other side of the Warner lot and left them to their own devices. That absolute dump of a building was nicknamed Termite Terrace. Even though this trio only worked in that building for about a year, Termite Terrace became the name of any building where the Schlesinger cartoons were created, carrying with it that same sense that these were little weirdos and outsiders set apart from the rest of the Warner studio and from the rest of the animation business. Progress, I think, tends to come from the margins. And it was in those margins of Hollywood that Tex Avery and Bob Clampett pushed the Schlesinger cartoons to be truly Looney Tunes. I should say, I'm not usually one to call people or things loony or insane or crazy or mad. I generally don't find these to be very helpful constructs. I think if you take any of those ideas and pop open the hood to see what's inside, I think just a lot of smoke comes out and there isn't much left. I mean, are they referring to people being unreasonable or being abnormal? Because unless you think you live in a society that has, like, perfect norms that are super duper logical and all check out, you probably don't want to conflate those two. I mean, unless you're doing so subversively, to disruptively shake up the assumptions about sanity and normalcy. And I think the idea that these cartoons and their characters could be lovable because they were so weird, so daffy, and, as they might describe themselves, so loony, it does demonstrate that subversive quality. I don't feel great about the fact that our understanding of madness today, at least in mainstream culture, isn't much further along than it was in the 1930s. That's pretty concerning to me, but maybe the way these cartoons showcased characters who are proud to be loony helped pave the way to the birth of the Mad Pride movement years later. Maybe they were just what was needed for their time. The first character to start moving the studio in this direction was Porky Pig, who was just one of many animal characters in the ensemble cast of Friz Freling's 1935 short, I Haven't Got a Hat. When Tex Avery was starting at Warner Brothers, he screened some of the studio's recent output, saw Porky Pig in that cartoon, and somehow saw potential there. There may not have been much to Porky Pig besides the fact that he stutters, but that at least made him stand out, which the studio desperately needed to do. Tex started reworking Porky into a likable everyman, and soon enough put Porky into a situation with which he was personally very familiar: hunting. The 1937 short, Porky's Duck Hunt, minimized the song portion that the studio valued so much at the time to make more room for various hunting gags, and Tex thought it would be a good idea to have several ducks bothering Porky. Animator Bob Clampett claims to have suggested focusing on just one duck. According to animation historian Michael Barrier, quote, Daffy was an anomaly in the cartoons of 1937 because he was deliberately one-dimensional. He lived only in the gags he pulled on Porky. If he wasn't funny, he was pointless, as Avery made very clear by having Daffy disregard the script to get a laugh.
Hey, that wasn't in the script.
Don't let it worry you, Skipper. I'm just a crazy darn fool duck.
Barrier continues, there was nothing cute or poignant or charming about Daffy. Unlike Porky Pig, Daffy had no trace of Disney in him. He was, in other words, a character wholly compatible with Avery's developing ideas about what should go into an animated cartoon. End quote. When Daffy needed to exit a scene in that cartoon, Tex left it up to Clampett to come up with and animate the eccentric duck's exit. The flips and jumps and woohoos from Mel Blanc ended up defining the character. Clampett became a director himself that year, bringing the same irreverent, daring spirit to the screen that Avery did, but with his own developing style and his own design for Porky Pig. According to Leonard Maltin, quote, Clampett's first real gem was the incredible Porky in Wackyland, end quote. In Jerry Beck's book, The 100 Greatest Looney Tunes Cartoons, animation historian Steve Schneider calls Porky in Wackyland Warner Brothers' Emancipation Proclamation. He writes, quote, building on the creaky liberties inaugurated by director Tex Avery, here Bob Clampett scoffs and shreds the conventions, realism, literalism, infantilism, cutesiness, and worse, that, with the ascendancy of Disney, had come to caramelize cartooning. By reminding us of animation's horizons, namely, none at all, this anything-goes film illustrates Sigmund Freud's notion that humor arises from breaking taboos, and breaking taboos is something that animation, with its limitless freedom, is uniquely gifted to do. End quote. So, now that you've got some context, let's dive into this podcast's first featured short. This week's trip through ToonTown takes us to 1938. The studio is Warner Brothers. The director is Bob Clampett. The cartoon is Porky in Wackyland. The credited animators on this cartoon are Norman McCabe and I. Ellis, and the vocal performances come from, at least some of them, come from a radio actor who had recently joined the studio, Mel Blanc, man of 1,000 questionable dialects. Also, remember how I said the Silly Symphonies were created to showcase the talents of composer Carl Stalling? Well, by this point, Warner Brothers had snatched up Carl Stalling, so you'll hear his music in this short, and in most of the Warner Brothers cartoons we'll cover from here on out. The story seems to come from Bob Clampett himself, who was inspired by a newspaper article he read about someone traveling to Africa in search of the dodo bird. And that's where our cartoon begins. Even as the credits are still on screen, a paperboy seems to run out in front of the film itself and hits us with a newspaper article about Porky's mission. The headline says the dodo is worth $4,000 billion, but adds P.S. 000, 000, 000, making the dodo worth $4 sextillion. I tried entering that into an inflation calculator, and somewhere in the world, a server caught fire. We get a great example of Carl Stalling's love of cheeky musical interpolation right away, as Porky's flight in his little airplane is underscored by the song Feelin' High and Happy. To give you a sense of what it sounds like when Stalling does this, here's what that song sounds like in the cartoon, followed by a bit of the popular recording by jazz trumpeter, vocalist, and band leader Hot Lips Page.
Hi, folks. Here's his picture.
I'll reserve a ringside seat for two. Nothing but the best will do. Let's go. I'm feeling high and happy.
Porky shows us a picture of the dodo to help us remember what the cartoon is supposedly about, and then flies into, and I'm sorry for this, dark Africa, then darker Africa, then darkest Africa. Mercifully, this film isn't really interested in going anywhere with that idea, since the place where Porky lands is not so much a lampoon of any regions of the continent of Africa, so much as it is a feverish remix of Salvador Dali. On the Welcome to Wackyland sign, we see and hear the words, "It can happen here." I know it was common to do that voice for comedic effect at the time. You hear something very much like it in the Tom and Jerry cartoon Mouse Trouble when Tom says, "Don't you believe it?" But I still don't know where that voice comes from. I mean, I know who's doing it. I'm pretty sure it's writer Ted Pierce. But the words that we hear are a reference to Sinclair Lewis's 1935 novel, It Can't Happen Here, which is about how a fascist demagogue became president of the United States because the people were too confident that it couldn't happen here. It was a very popular book at the time that the audience for Porky Pig cartoons would have been seriously thinking about. And my feeling about that is... But you know, that makes Wackyland sound kind of threatening, if you think about it. Like, if you think about the specifics of what it is that can happen here. But I like the idea that because this place isn't holding itself accountable to some sense of normalcy, it would be able to admit that fascism is a very real possibility there. There's no way that's what any of these animators were thinking, I don't imagine. But, you know, it's something to think about. This is when we get the parade of zany characters and visuals. And I'm not going to describe all of them to you, but I'd like to highlight a few. The first character Porky encounters is toying with gender expectations. What a way to introduce the Looney Tunes whole deal. Porky's initial reaction to the characters lifting up the sunrise, his little like, "Oh, you silly," that delights me every time. It's just so not the reaction you're expecting. And I think it's interesting that once the cartoon has shown you Porky shocked and Porky delighted, it knows it's kind of gone through all the reactions you're going to get out of Porky, and the reactions are just not going to be that interesting to us anymore. So it does away with them for a lot of the cartoon. We just abandoned the protagonist for most of the middle section because he's not essential to the gags. Clampett, he knew where his priorities were. Relatedly, I think it's worth noting that this cartoon was originally supposed to pair Porky with another character on this trip, but I think the choice to remove that character again shows how good these directors were at prioritizing. At least when they were at their best. They could really be economical. You'll notice the word foo, F-O-O, appears prominently in this cartoon. That was a nonsense word from the comic strip Smokey Stover that was very popular in the late 1930s. The writer of that comic, Bill Holman, would insert the word into dialogue in such a way that it sure seemed like it meant something, or at least was a substitute for another word, but whatever it meant changed every time, so you could never really figure this word out. This is why, in World War II, pilots decided it would be funny to start calling everything they saw flying over Europe that they couldn't identify, foo. The pilots who encountered these unidentified flying machines came to be known as, yes, Foo Fighters. It's true. Then we see the unfortunate Al Jolson creature, a wide-mouthed little guy most people call a duck. I guess he kind of looks like a flattened Daffy. Now, I ask you, is it actually that out of the ordinary for a cartoon from this time to feature some minstrelsy? No. It was the norm, and in some ways it was old hat. The jazz singer was 11 years old. Minstrel shows date back to the middle of the 19th century, and blackface was already commonplace before then. I say this to say, if you're looking for what's wacky, bold, and breaking taboos, the stuff that defines the Warner cartoon spirit, it can't really be the racist caricatures, can it? There are choices made with this character that are zany in the Warner spirit. It's in the way he's looking at us and the odd rhythm of his movements. He looks almost scared, like he's doomed to walk the earth by switching which knee he's kneeling on, but always ending up in the same pose and repeating the same word. Hence why I'm inclined to resist the idea that is, intentionally or not, implied in Sandler's introduction to Reading the Rabbit. The idea that the harmful images in these films are an essential part of the Looney Tunes spirit, and without the freedom to be hurtful, the franchise doesn't work. These are parts of the cultural norms of the time that the studio was repeating for easy laughs, or at best putting creative spins on sometimes, which doesn't really factor into the studio's distinctive taboo-breaking rebellion. Really, it's the limitation of that rebellion. It's where the studio fell short in its attempts to radically overthrow the conventions. Conflating the elements of these cartoons that are shocking to audiences after the civil rights movement with the elements that were shocking when the cartoons were made, as I really think a lot of people do, is kind of a contradiction. It strikes me as almost anti-historical. That's not to say these aspects of the film should be written off and ignored, but making them central to the Looney Tunes discussion pushes aside what's historically significant about the Looney Tunes in favor of what's unusual now. Anyway, moving on. The three-headed Three Stooges thing really weirds me out when its heads get up close to the camera and move in unison. The hold on their smile is just so freaking unsettling. So the little light bulb guy rolls in and translates their noises for us, saying his mama was scared by a pawnbroker's sign. This is in reference to how pawn shops have 3 hanging golden spheres on their signs to make them easy to recognize, which is what the 3 heads of this stooge creature are posed like in this shot. A ridiculous joke. I kind of appreciate it, but oh boy. Porky sees a sign for information about the dodo and steps inside, only to fall down in Alice in Wonderland fashion to the front door of the dodo's abode. That's fun to say.
Introducing, in person, the dodo.
There's a really slick transformation here when the dodo jumps on his castle's drawbridge and it becomes a speedboat before you can process what about it was changed. And I get such a kick out of the way he releases an anchor just to sink the boat. I think it's his pose when he does it, as he just kind of stands there and waits and then is kind of satisfied with himself, like, good, the boat is sunk, mission accomplished. I love the clarification we get from the dodo when he finally speaks and then scats, that he's not the last of the dodos, as in the real bird, which is one word with no hyphen, but the last of the dodos, with a hyphen, like named after the jazzy singing he likes, the do-do-do-do-do-do-do.
Yes, I'm really the last of the dodos.
That bit about him being the last of the dodos would, as you know, turn out to be a lie, thereby destroying the premise of the cartoon. Figures. Or maybe it wasn't a lie. Maybe our logical concepts of singularity and multiplicity being mutually exclusive don't apply to dodos. What happens next is a series of Daffy-esque antics from the dodo that soon develop into magical powers. My favorite is when he rides the Warner Brothers logo from the start of the cartoon in and out of the scene, showing that these characters have always been corporate shills. They just need to be allowed to do it weirdly. You know, I was talking with a friend of mine the other day about this podcast and asked if there were any cartoons she'd like to come on and talk about, and she mentioned that Porky in Wackyland was her favorite classic cartoon. Her reason for singling out this cartoon totally surprised me, and I think it will surprise you too. So here's a little bit of my conversation with my friend and fellow ToughPigs writer, Becca Petunia, about her history with the dodo bird. So tell me, Becca, why Porky in Wackyland?
So here's what's so interesting. I haven't seen Porky in Wackyland, the cartoon, until about the year 2020, I want to say.
Okay.
But as a kid, I was fascinated by the dodo. And not because of Tiny Toons either, which did prominently feature a dodo who's different than the dodo, But
Thank you for
because
clarifying, because someone would have gotten in the comments.
so there was a comic that came out in the year 2000 called Superman and Bugs Bunny. It was a 4-issue miniseries that was written by Mark Evanier or Evanier. I've never been sure how to pronounce
I
that.
think it's just Evanier, but I don't know either. Pronouncing names is going to be a big problem on this show. Please go on.
And penciled by Joe Staton or Staten or Staton. But
Maybe all three.
yeah, but this was a 4-issue miniseries in which Superman meets Bugs Bunny, and by extension, the entire Justice League meets the entire Looney Tunes family.
Perfect.
And
Incredible.
they did a bunch of like weird ideas in it. Green Arrow finds Michigan J. Frog, and Green Arrow is the only one who can hear Michigan J. Frog, and the rest of the Justice League thinks that Green Arrow is losing his mind. But the overall conceit of this series is that Mr. Mxyzptlk decides that to annoy the Justice League, he is going to get the Looney Tunes involved. And specifically, he teams up with who the comic kind of presents as the main sort of like trickster who's always getting one over on the Looney Tunes, who is the Dodo. And Mxyzptlk and the Dodo are the two main villains of this comic. They use their reality bending powers to get the Looney Tunes into the DC universe. And then as the comic goes, literally starts switching people's powers around. So there's an issue where Elmer Fudd has all of the powers of Superman because Mxyzptlk and Dodo are able to do that. I loved this comic. I haven't read it in years, and I can literally picture all of these things. So for years, I thought that Dodo was like one of the Looney Tunes guys.
Sure, right.
Like,
up there with like on like a Porky Pig level of fame and popularity and significance in the cartoon canon.
exactly. So around 2019, 2020, I was like, what's the deal with Dodo? Because I remember him being a big deal, but I feel like I never see him anymore. And then I did this deep dive, as I have a tendency to do, because I have a kind of obsessive personality,
Good, we love it.
And read like everything there was to know. And what was fascinating to me is he basically is in one cartoon. I mean,
he is in Porky and Wackyland, and he is in a remake of Porky and Wackyland.
Correct. And yet you would read, on all of these different wikis, and it was amazing how many later, more modern creators seemed fascinated by Dodo. Again, like obviously the Tiny Toons team made their own Dodo. And I always forget if he's Go-Go Dodo or if he's Yo-Yo Dodo. And there's someone at home who's yelling at me right now. And that someone might be J.D. Hansel.
It's not. Truly, this is... here's the thing.
Is this
Becca,
more about Dodo than you ever thought anyone would have?
Way more. Becca, here's the thing. I didn't grow up with all that much of the cartoon renaissance because I was born a bit later than you. And so I saw barely any Animaniacs, barely any Tiny Toons. I just don't have much of a history with that stuff, and I don't have much history with a lot of the other cartoons, the other like animated series that people were watching that sort of came out of that period, whether it's like a Dexter's Laboratory kind of thing, like all of that stuff. It's like I caught little glimpses of it as it was dying out. But I could tell I was kind of missing something and catching the tail end of something, and that something was a century filled with pop culture that I find interesting. That's what I missed.
Okay, so it turns out I was checking while you said that, although I was listening, that the Tiny Toons character is Go-Go Dodo. And then the Dodo from Porky and Wackyland has later been renamed Yo-Yo Dodo. And that's what I was about to get into because it is amazing how many later dubiously canon things feature Yo-Yo Dodo and Wackyland. And this is what I was learning as I was doing this deep dive, because like there's a Wackyland race course in like a Looney Tunes kart racing video game released for the Game Boy Color. And in Looney Tunes Acme Arsenal Unleashed, like Dodo is an enemy character in that. And
Good.
it's like none of these things matter, right? But I was like, it is amazing how
You
this.
anger so many people when you say things don't matter. You're right, but also none of what we're doing here matters.
Well,
But
I guess I mean like in the scheme even of like your show is about the golden age of cartoons, and I'd be
yeah,
hard pressed to say that a poorly reviewed Wii game from 2008 or so is a key part of the golden age of
right.
cartoons.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
That's what I mean. But what's interesting to me, and what I was interesting to me as I was doing this deep dive, is I was like, wow, this cartoon about the dodo clearly must have been something special. If it's something that people remember this much and inspired all of these other uses and made me believe as a a young preteen in the year 2000 that Dodo was like a major figure, that Dodo was like Yosemite Sam, and Bugs was always having to get one over on Dodo. So I watched Porky and Wackyland, and the truth is, I think it is that good. I mean,
Wow.
the racism aside, like
Right.
let's leave that out for the sake of this argument. But I think from the moment Porky sees the dodo bird to
hmm
the end is so good and so much fun and so silly and so inventive and so creative. And I was like, you know what? I do love the dodo. So to this day, 5 years later, the dodo remains my favorite Looney Tunes character, despite really only appearing in this one thing.
And you know what, Becca? The dodo is a fan favorite. Like a lot of people gravitate towards the dodo. There was a reference to the dodo bird in that miserable Chip and Dale movie that you may recall from a few years ago.
I do
It's,
recall it. I wish I didn't.
I know, I'm sorry. I just did that to you. That wasn't fair of me. I apologize. But still, like, yes, the dodo has quite a legacy, and I think it's because the dodo captures the spirit of everything that the Warner Brothers studio was starting to do. Like everything that the Warner Brothers studio was about, just as they were starting to do it. It's their thesis statement is all wrapped up in Porky and Wackyland, and the embodiment of it, like the figurehead, the mascot of Wackyland, is the dodo.
And I think Wackyland really holds up. And I'm sure you've talked about it elsewhere, or you will talk about it soon. But I really liked the new Wackyland cartoon that premiered last year.
Becca, this is the first I'm hearing of that.
Oh my God, JD Hansel!
Listen,
There was a stop motion animated Daffy in Wackyland short.
I have heard of that. I didn't know that it was out and available. But here's the thing,
It's
Becca,
good.
so you and I have been talking about how, I guess this was maybe off mic or before we started recording, but we were talking about how you have found that you gravitate towards classic stuff. You gravitate toward, well, like with the Muppet stuff, you gravitate towards a lot from the 60s and 70s. I get that completely. And I think that for me, I'm keeping my focus pretty strictly to the classic period. And I find that I enjoy these cartoons best when I don't think too much about the fact that this is still an active franchise and these characters are still going and
I
people are
hear
still
that.
trying to do things with these characters. You know what I mean?
I hear that completely because we've had a conversation again elsewhere about how sometimes it makes that very difficult with like Muppet fandom, obviously something that I'm very much a part of and a power player in for whatever that counts, that it is sometimes hard to
Is this because
realize.
you can't say that you're a titan of fandom because you wrote an article about how nobody's a titan of fandom? Is this, you're nodding your head. Okay, go on.
Well, you're gonna have your editing work cut out for you here, or not.
Yeah,
But,
that's the problem for you, is it might be or not. Go on.
no, but when I was saying power player, I was raising my eyebrows. I meant that
That's the other physical
sarcastically.
component we have to explain for our listeners, is that
I
you were
meant
clearly being cheeky about it.
yes, because I don't believe that it's a thing. But the
Right.
point is, like, when it comes to all of these things, it's always so weird to think like about franchises that have been around as long as something like the Looney Tunes,
Mm-hmm.
because you start and it's so much like the vision of a couple of specific creators
Mm-hmm.
and like what they think Porky should do and should be. And then to think about how here we are, 70 years later, 80, 90 years later for
That's more like it. Yeah.
some of these characters. And now other people are saying what Porky is like and
Right.
what Daffy is like. And that gets like, and it's this weird thing to be like, these characters are always in flux and I'm not always going to like what they're doing, right?
Right.
So it's this thing where looking back and being like, this is what, with the classic stuff, it's like when I watch old Muppet stuff, it's like, well, this is how Jim Henson viewed the relationship between Ernie and Bert, and that's the sort of pure kernel. But the amount of people who have said what Ernie and Bert are over the years is a phenomenally large number.
Right.
And it can't always be the same. And I think that, going back to what you said, that is something that is kind of magical about Porky and Wackyland.
Well, that's what's good about it, is that it's free to just be a film without having to think about itself as a representation of a character or even a pitch for a character. It doesn't have to be like, get ready, this is Porky Pig now, and this is his new foe forever, the dodo bird. It can just be like, here's a good idea for a film, and these characters that you'll see will just be expressions of the idea for the film and expressions of the jokes that we have. And if you never see them again, who cares? We made a good film.
Yeah.
Gotta love that.
Which is the thing about, again, about film that unfortunately doesn't happen enough these days in general. And we could talk for hours about like franchise filmmaking, but like when I watch a movie, when you watch like The Graduate, you're not thinking to yourself like, boy, I need to know what happens to these characters next. I can't wait. Did you see the post-credits scene? Did you see what
Right.
Did you see who The Graduate is going to meet next? No.
Yeah.
The Graduate doesn't exist when the film ends. I can't remember the name of The Graduate, but you know what I mean.
Yes. Right. Okay. I'm with you now. Okay. You meant the character The Graduate doesn't. Yes, exactly.
Yes.
And that's good.
The boy who graduated does not exist when the film ends. And that's the problem with a franchise versus a singular piece of media.
Becca, thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank you, JD.
What's interesting about this cartoon looking at it now is how it places a screwball character, like, Daffy Duck, Bugs Bunny, Woody Woodpecker, in a featured role, but not the lead role. The Dodo's what the cartoon is about, but he's not the protagonist. From what I can tell, this was pretty typical for a 1930s cartoon. The protagonist is a Mickey Mouse-type everyman who we join for his encounter with the wacky. This is the way that Daffy Duck's first cartoon, Porky's Duck Hunt, was approached. We're following Porky, and then we get a little bit of Daffy Duck, which now sounds unthinkable. And yet, this cartoon, Porky and Wackyland, evidences that this approach to a cartoon can work. It can happen here. It's just not what most of the studio's later cartoons would be like. And there's a lot to be said for making the funny screwball character the star, like really the protagonist, the driving force in the cartoon. The shift in the studio's attitude, and perhaps more than anything, the public's attitude between 1938 and the arrival of Bugs Bunny and Woody Woodpecker in 1940 is really astonishing. They no longer identified with the Mickey Mousey everyman hunter, they identified with the zany little stinker being hunted. Remember what I said before about the narrative of the small and meek versus the big and strong? This shift that would define Bugs Bunny, I think quite correctly, places the character who is mentally the outsider in the role of the meek, the supposed victim. I say supposed because the screwball's indifference to normalcy, to the rules of the game, doesn't only give him the power to resist hierarchies, but to reveal their meaninglessness and absurdity and break them down. Even still, the Dodo's role in this cartoon is subversive, especially in relation to what Disney was doing. In Disney's work, the wacky and fantastical is something the protagonist draws out of the world around him, always controlling it. It's wish fulfillment, it's contained, it's safe. That's all overgeneralizing, but I really, so far, from what I've seen, that's the gist. In Porky and Wackyland, the wacky and fantastical are things that happen to the protagonist and happen to you. And the ending assures us that it cannot be captured. The weird cannot be controlled or contained. And maybe that's not always such a bad thing. This cartoon has quite a legacy. Its 1949 remake by Friz Freleng, Dough for the Dodo, sticks super closely to the source material, and 11 years later, that number's coming up a lot, 11 years later, it still basically fits in with other Looney Tunes cartoons because of how perfectly this cartoon encapsulated the studio's voice. Porky and Wackyland is ranked at number 8 in the 50 Greatest Cartoons, as selected by 1,000 animation professionals. That's a book edited by Jerry Beck, published in 1994. In 2000, the United States Library of Congress selected this film for preservation in the National Film Registry. Bob Clampett's style would continue to evolve and flourish, with animation standing out from all his contemporaries, and he is still studied and celebrated by animators today. In fact, The Day the Earth Blew Up is largely a tribute to Bob Clampett, his style, his humor, and his approach to Porky and Daffy. It even features a scene set at Clampett's diner, in which the server is played by Ruth Clampett, Bob's daughter. Through the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, the Looney Tunes continued in the direction established by Clampett and Tex Avery, as directors like Frank Tashlin, who I probably should have mentioned sooner than this, Chuck Jones, Friz Freleng, Robert McKimson, and Arthur Davis kindly gave us countless cartoon masterpieces. In September of 1938, the Leon Schlesinger studio held a private screening of Porky and Wackyland for the staff, encouraging them to fill out cards to provide feedback, as was standard practice at the studio. Unsurprisingly, the film was received very positively. One commenter said it was one of Clampett's best. Director Frank Tashlin said, "The animation is tops, better than from the other units." Storyman Michael Maltese wrote, "Keep this up, and we'll all be candidates for Wackyland." With this podcast, I'm offering you a free trip to Wackyland, with the catch being, you're already there. We all are. You can try to hold on to normalcy, but it's not going to work. Instead, I welcome you to experience the freedom of folly, the liberty of lunacy, and the emancipation of animation. Folks, it's about time for me to say so long. I don't know yet whether this show will be released weekly or every other week, but at some point soon, Stick to Shorts will return with an episode about a cartoon that Leonard Maltin described as a great piece of work that some people see as a profound parable. I am, of course, talking about the cartoon where the frog jumps up and sings "Hello, my baby" one froggy evening. You can follow the podcast on Blue Sky at Stick to Shorts and find me on Blue Sky at JD11PC. You can read my writing about Muppets at ToughPigs.com, where you'll also find my podcast, The Great Muppet Fandom Panel. I hope this podcast has added something halfway valuable to the cartoon conversation. At the very least, I hope it's encouraged you to challenge the norm and try something kind of radical. And when you do, let me be the first person to tell you, stick to shorts!